In a quiet neighborhood on Willow Street, a mother and daughter's ordinary life is shaken by an unexpected discovery: a frail, elderly woman found helpless and alone by an old dumpster. Hannah, a compassionate young mother, cannot turn away from the stranger's silent plea for help. As Hannah learns the heartbreaking truth about the woman, Margaret Harper, she uncovers a story of betrayal, loss, and unimaginable resilience. Margaret, once a proud homeowner with a life filled with love, was cast aside by her own son, left with nothing but memories of a home that was stolen from her. But Hannah refuses to let Margaret's story end in tragedy. What begins as an act of kindness turns into a fight for justice, one that draws their community together and reignites hope in Margaret's heart. Can Margaret find the strength to reclaim not just her house, but her sense of dignity and belonging? And what will happen when she must finally face the son who betrayed her? The sun rose slowly over the small apartment complex on Willow Street, painting the cracked pavement in soft golden hues. Hannah Brooks was already awake, standing in the kitchen of her modest two-bedroom apartment. The counters were lined with small jars of cereal and a bowl of fruit. She worked hard to make their space feel warm and homey, though the old linoleum floors and faded wallpaper told the story of years of wear and tear. Her 3-year-old daughter, Lily, sat at the small table, swinging her legs back and forth in rhythm. Her blonde curls caught the morning light as she played with a plastic spoon. "Are you hungry, Lily?" Hannah asked, setting a bowl of cereal in front of her. Lily nodded enthusiastically, but then paused, her bright eyes drifting toward the window. Hannah followed her daughter's gaze. The dumpster at the edge of the parking lot was a rusted old relic of the past, a large, dented metal container with chipped paint and broken wheels. The complex management had promised to replace it months ago, but like so many things, the promise had fallen through. It was just a dumpster, Hannah reminded herself, a forgotten object at the edge of their world. But Lily's face grew serious. She set her spoon down, her small hand pointing toward the window. "There," Lily whispered. "There is someone there." Hannah froze mid-step. "Sweetie, what do you mean?" "A lady," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "She is crying." Hannah frowned, trying to steady the strange sense of unease that tugged at her heart. She glanced out the window again, but saw only the usual shadows cast by the early morning sun. "Maybe you dreamed it," Hannah said gently, brushing Lily's hair out of her face. Lily's lips quivered, and she leaned closer to her mother. "No, Mommy, she was there." Hannah gave her a reassuring smile, though a small chill ran down her spine. "It is okay, baby. It is just a dumpster." She kissed the top of Lily's head and tried to push the unsettling thought away. The day passed uneventfully, but by late afternoon, Hannah could not shake the memory of Lily's words. When it was time to take Lily out for their evening walk, Hannah hesitated as they approached the path leading toward the dumpster. Lily clung to Hannah's hand, her small face pale. "Please, Mommy, do not go that way." Hannah bent down to Lily's level, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "We can take another route, okay?" Lily nodded tearfully. Instead of cutting across the lot as usual, Hannah turned toward the small garden path behind the complex. They passed the playground and the wooden bench, where their elderly neighbor Rachel Carter liked to sit in the evenings. Rachel was there now, a basket of knitting in her lap. "Evening, Hannah," Rachel greeted with a warm smile. Hannah returned the greeting and, after a moment's thought, approached the bench. Rachel had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. She had seen everything that had ever happened in this corner of the city. "Rachel," Hannah began hesitantly, "have you ever noticed anything strange near the old dumpster?" Rachel's knitting needles paused mid-click. She looked up, her brow furrowed. "Strange? What do you mean?" Hannah hesitated. "Lily says she saw someone there, a lady. She said the lady was crying." Rachel's face softened as she reached out to pat Lily's hand. "Children see things differently," she said gently. "But," She paused, her voice lowering. There have been stories. An old woman used to live near here. Some say she disappeared under strange circumstances. Hannah felt her heart beat faster. Do you think it is true? Rachel shook her head slowly. I do not know, but sometimes the past lingers in places we least expect. Hannah managed a small, polite smile before excusing herself and continuing the walk. But Rachel's words stayed with her. By the time they returned home, the shadows of the evening had begun to stretch long and thin across the street. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Hannah sat by the window, watching the lot below. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow over the dumpster. She told herself it was just an old bin, nothing more. But just as she began to turn away, she heard it. A faint sound drifted through the window. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, a scraping noise. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. Maybe it was a stray cat, or the wind brushing leaves against the metal. But then, the sound came again, more insistent this time. Her mind raced. You are overreacting, she whispered aloud, trying to steady herself. But her nerves betrayed her, as the sound continued, a low, almost mournful noise. Hannah's chest tightened. She closed the window and pulled the curtains shut, forcing herself to breathe evenly. But as she climbed into bed, she could still hear it echoing in her mind, the soft, distant scrape of something or someone. She lay awake long after the house fell silent. The strange feeling of being watched lingered like an unseen shadow. Before sleep finally claimed her, she whispered softly into the quiet room, "What is out there?" The next morning, the city was bright and bustling as usual, but Hannah felt disconnected, as if something had shifted beneath the surface of her everyday life. She tried to shake the feeling as she went about her morning routine, packing Lily's small backpack and folding the lawn dry. But Lily's anxious face when they passed the window kept resurfacing in her thoughts. Hannah knew that if she ignored the fear any longer, it would only grow. She made herself a silent promise. Tonight, she would find out the truth, no matter what. As the hours ticked by, the tension in Hannah's chest grew. The faint sounds from the night before replayed in her head, mixing with Lily's soft voice and Rachel's cryptic words. By the time the sun began to set again, Hannah had made up her mind. She was tired of fear and uncertainty. Whatever was hiding in the shadows, she would face it head-on. She did not yet know how much her life was about to change. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, tapping her fingers against her coffee mug. The faint scent of lavender from the candle she had lit earlier did little to calm her nerves. Lily was asleep in her room, her soft breathing the only sign of peace in the house. But Hannah's mind was restless. She could not let go of the scratching noise from the night before, or the way Lily had described the woman by the dumpster. She glanced at the clock, 11:48 p.m. The world outside had slipped into stillness, the usual city hum quieted by the late hour. The streetlights cast a faint glow through the windows, creating long shadows that seemed to shift when she looked away. Hannah stood slowly, her heartbeat thudding in her chest as she walked toward the window. The curtains fluttered slightly as she pulled them back. The old dumpster sat in its usual spot, covered in grime and flecks of rust, but otherwise ordinary. Her eyes scanned the lot carefully. Nothing moved, no stray cats, no people, just the cold, empty street. And then she heard it again. The faint scratching noise, soft but persistent. Hannah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She leaned closer to the window, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was unmistakable now, like something or someone dragging their nails across metal. She stepped back quickly, her breath shallow. "It is just the wind," she muttered, trying to reassure herself. But deep down, she knew it was not. The noise continued, almost mournful in its rhythm, rising and falling like a quiet plea. She could not take it anymore. Grabbing her coat, Hannah slipped it over her shoulders and tiptoed to Lily's room. She peered inside, making sure her daughter was still fast asleep. Then she grabbed her keys and quietly opened the front door. The cold air stung her face as she stepped outside, the quiet of the night pressing in around her. Her footsteps echoed faintly as she crossed the lot toward the dumpster. She hesitated when she reached it, suddenly aware of how alone she was. The shadows seemed to pool around her feet as the dull metal frame loomed before her. The scratching had stopped. Hannah stared at the dumpster for a long moment, heart racing. She knew she could turn back, return to the warmth of her apartment, and tell herself she had imagined it all. But something deeper, something stronger, urged her forward. She reached out with trembling fingers and grasped the edge of the lid. The metal was cold beneath her touch. Slowly, she began to lift it, the hinges groaning in protest. Her breath caught in her throat as the lid swung open. Inside, huddled in the shadows, was a frail figure. It was an elderly woman, wrapped in layers of ragged clothing. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes half closed. Her gray hair clung to her forehead, damp with sweat. She barely stirred as the light from the street lamp spilled over her. Hannah felt a wave of shock and horror rise within her. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. She whispered something so faint that Hannah had to lean closer to hear. "Help me," the woman rasped, her voice dry and brittle like autumn leaves. Without thinking, Hannah reached for her phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling. "There is an elderly woman here," she told the dispatcher, her voice shaking. "She is hurt. She needs help." The dispatcher asked for the location, and Hannah quickly gave it. "An ambulance is on the way," the calm voice assured her. "Stay with her until they arrive." Hannah lowered her phone and crouched beside the dumpster, gently taking the woman's hand. Her skin was cold, fragile like paper. "You are going to be okay," Hannah said softly, though she felt anything but certain. "Help is coming." The woman's lips trembled, forming words that barely made it past her cracked mouth. "I did not want to be forgotten." Hannah's chest tightened. She could not fathom how someone could end up like this, left to suffer alone in the dark. She blinked back tears and tightened her hold on the woman's hand. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. The ambulance pulled into the lot, and two paramedics jumped out, hurrying over with a stretcher. Hannah stepped back as they gently lifted the woman from the dumpster, their voices calm and professional. "Severely dehydrated. Signs of malnourishment," one of them said. "She will need immediate fluids." Hannah nodded numbly as they secured the woman on the stretcher and wheeled her toward the ambulance. One of the paramedics, a man in his 30s with a kind face, turned to Hannah. "You did the right thing by calling us. You may have saved her life." Hannah barely managed a nod. She watched as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, sirens wailing into the distance. She stood there in the cold for a long time, staring at the empty spot where the dumpster remained. The faint scratching noise that had haunted her was gone, replaced by a deeper silence, the kind that settles after something important has happened. As she turned to walk back to her apartment, she realized she was trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of what had just occurred. Inside, the warmth of the apartment greeted her, but her mind was still on the fragile woman she had found. Who was she? How long had she been there, suffering unseen? And more importantly, how could someone be so abandoned in a city full of people? Hannah moved quietly into Lily's room and knelt by her daughter's bed. Lily was still sound asleep, her face peaceful. Hannah smoothed back her daughter's hair and whispered, "You were right, sweetie. There was someone there." Her heart ached with a mixture of fear, sadness, and determination. She did not know who the woman was or where her story began, but she knew one thing for certain: she would not let this go. The world had failed that woman once. Hannah would make sure it did not happen again. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with a slight drizzle tapping softly against the windows. Hannah barely slept after the events of the night. She sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands. The memory of the frail woman's voice still echoed in her mind. "I did not want to be forgotten." The words felt heavier in the quiet of the morning. Hannah stared at the steam rising from the mug, willing herself to focus. Lily wandered in, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mommy?" she asked, her small voice breaking the silence. Hannah's gaze softened as she scooped her daughter into her arms. "Good morning, sweetheart." She kissed the top of Lily's head. Lily tilted her head and looked at her mother curiously. "Is the lady okay?" Hannah hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I hope so, baby. The doctors are taking care of her now." Lily nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. She reached for her cereal, but Hannah felt the weight of her daughter's innocent question linger. How could she explain the sadness she felt, the helplessness of knowing that someone had been suffering in silence? Later that day, after dropping Lily off at Rachel's for a playdate, Hannah decided she needed answers. The image of the woman lying helpless in the dumpster haunted her. Hannah grabbed her coat, slipped into her car, and drove to St. Mercy Hospital, where the ambulance had taken the woman the night before. The hospital lobby was busy with the usual stream of nurses, patients, and visitors. Hannah approached the front desk, feeling awkward but determined. "Hi," she began, clearing her throat. "I'm here to check on an elderly woman who was brought in last night. She was found outside our apartment complex. I just want to know if she's okay." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, typed something into her computer. "Do you know her name?" Hannah paused, realizing that she did not. "No, I don't." But she was elderly, with gray hair, and she looked very frail. The receptionist nodded. "Let me check." After a moment, she looked up. "You must be talking about Margaret Harper. She was admitted last night. She's stable now, but she was severely dehydrated and malnourished." Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Is she awake?" The receptionist hesitated, then motioned toward the hall. "She woke up a little while ago. Room 207. You can visit if you'd like." "Thank you," Hannah said sincerely as she made her way toward the elevator. The walk to room 207 felt surreal. The door was partially open, and Hannah peeked inside. The woman Margaret lay on the hospital bed, propped up by pillows. Her eyes were closed, and the IV line taped to her thin arm fed her slowly. Hannah stepped in quietly. At the sound of her soft footsteps, Margaret's eyes opened. They were no longer glassy but clear, though they held a deep, weary sadness. "Hello, Mrs. Harper," Hannah said gently as she approached the bed. Margaret blinked, her gaze sharpening as she took in Hannah's face. You are the one who found me." Hannah nodded, sitting in the chair by the bed. "Yes, my name is Hannah." Margaret's lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed unsure whether to speak. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Hannah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't just leave you there." Margaret's frail hands tightened slightly on the blanket. Her voice was quiet but steady. I thought I was going to die there, alone." Hannah felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say something comforting, but no words seemed enough. "You are not alone now," she said finally. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "It is strange to have someone care." "Can I ask what happened?" Hannah's voice was gentle, cautious. She didn't want to pry, but she needed to understand. Margaret took a slow breath, her frail chest rising and falling. I trusted the wrong person," she began. "My son, Evan. He was all I had left after my husband passed. I thought he loved me, but I was wrong." Hannah leaned forward, listening intently. He convinced me to sign everything over to him, Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. He said it was for my own good. Then, he changed. He stopped visiting, stopped answering my calls. One day he took the house and left me behind. Hannah felt anger bubbling beneath her sadness. He left you with nothing? Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. I had nowhere to go, no family, no friends left. I wandered. I slept in shelters, on benches, until I ended up there. Her voice broke as she recalled the dumpster. Hannah reached out and gently took Margaret's hand. No one should have to go through that. No one. Margaret's fingers tightened around Hannah's. I thought I would die with no one knowing I ever existed. But you stopped. You cared. Hannah blinked back tears. You deserve better than what happened to you. Margaret's face softened, and for the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. You remind me of the kind people I thought the world had forgotten. Hannah stayed with Margaret for over an hour, listening to her story, asking questions, and learning about the life Margaret had lived before everything fell apart. When Hannah finally stood to leave, Margaret's eyes were calm. Will you come back? Margaret asked hesitantly. Hannah smiled warmly. Yes, I'll be back, and I'll make sure you have what you need. As Hannah walked out of the hospital and into the crisp afternoon air, her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She could not change what had happened to Margaret, but she could make sure Margaret never felt invisible again. She had no plan yet, but she knew one thing. This was only the beginning. Margaret's story wasn't over. It was time to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, healing, and the kindness of people who refused to let someone be forgotten. The late afternoon sun cast a soft glow over the apartment complex as Hannah returned home. She felt heavier somehow, not in a bad way, but as though the weight of Margaret's story had settled into her heart, making her more aware of how fragile life could be. Lily ran to meet her at the door, her face lighting up as Hannah scooped her into her arms. Mommy, did you see the lady? Lily asked eagerly. Hannah nodded and kissed her daughter's cheek. Yes, sweetheart. Her name is Margaret, and she's safe now. The doctors are taking care of her. Lily smiled, satisfied. Good. She hugged Hannah tightly before running back to the living room, where her coloring books were spread out across the coffee table. Hannah stood for a moment, watching Lily with a soft, protective gaze. She had been so lucky to have a life filled with love, even if money was tight. Margaret's story was a painful reminder of how quickly everything could be taken away. The next morning, Hannah found herself thinking of Margaret again as she made breakfast. The simple crackle of eggs in the pan felt almost out of place after everything she had learned. Margaret had been abandoned by her own son, a thought that made Hannah's stomach twist. She knew she could not let it end there. Margaret deserved more than a hospital bed and silence. Later that afternoon, Hannah drove back to St. Mercy Hospital, this time with a small bouquet of daisies she had picked up from a nearby florist. She wasn't sure if Margaret liked flowers, but she figured that anyone who had spent so much time in the shadows deserved something bright. Margaret's room was quiet when Hannah arrived. The older woman was awake, her eyes turned toward the window as the sunlight filtered through the blinds. Good afternoon, Hannah greeted, stepping inside. Margaret turned slowly, and a genuine smile spread across her tired face. You came back. Of course, Hannah said as she set the flowers on the bedside table. I told you I would. Margaret reached out for Hannah's hand, her touch still frail but warm. You have no idea what that means to me. Hannah settled into the chair by the bed. I brought you something. She gestured toward the flowers. I wasn't sure what you'd like. Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at the bouquet. They're lovely, she murmured. I used to grow daisies in my garden, before everything changed. You loved gardening? Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. It was my escape. After my husband passed, I would spend hours out there, planting, trimming, watching things grow. It felt like hope. Hannah listened intently, picturing the life Margaret must have had. "It sounds beautiful," she said. Margaret's smile faded slightly. It was. But after I lost the house, all of it was gone. The memories, the laughter, everything tied to that garden. Her voice caught for a moment before she took a deep breath. "I trusted Evan. I thought he would take care of me." Hannah's heart ached at the pain in Margaret's words. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Margaret's hand tightened around Hannah's. "I don't know why I'm telling you all of this, but I haven't spoken to anyone in so long." Hannah shook her head. "You don't have to apologize. I'm here to listen." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that felt comforting rather than awkward. Hannah noticed how the light framed Margaret's face, making her look softer, more at peace. "I want to help you," Hannah said finally. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "You've already helped me more than anyone else ever has." Hannah leaned forward. "You deserve more than survival, Margaret. You deserve a life filled with kindness and safety." She hesitated, then added, "Have you thought about talking to the police? They could help you get justice." Margaret's expression shifted. For a moment, fear flickered in her gaze. "I've thought about it. But Evan, he's powerful in his way, and I'm just an old woman." Hannah's voice was steady, full of quiet conviction. "You are not just an old woman. You are strong. You survived when most people wouldn't have. That means something." Margaret looked away, struggling with emotions she had buried for too long. "I've been afraid for so long," she admitted. "But maybe you're right." Hannah smiled gently. "We can take this one step at a time. I'll be with you, every step of the way." Margaret's lip trembled, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because no one should be forgotten," Hannah said simply. "You matter." Margaret blinked rapidly as tears spilled down her cheeks. For so long, she had felt invisible, like a shadow that no one noticed. But now, for the first time in years, she felt seen. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Hannah stayed until Margaret's eyelids grew heavy, and the older woman drifted into a peaceful sleep. As she stood to leave, she noticed how calm Margaret looked, as though the weight of her past had begun to lift, if only slightly. On her way out of the hospital, Hannah made a silent vow. She would do whatever it took to help Margaret rebuild her life. She would speak to anyone who could help Margaret regain what had been stolen from her. When Hannah stepped into the parking lot, the cool breeze brushed her face, carrying the scent of rain. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Margaret's story wasn't over, and neither was Hannah's. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the number for her friend Officer Jared Miller, a detective she had known since college. She paused, her thumb hovering over the call button. Then she pressed it. "Jared, it's Hannah. I need your help." The following morning, Hannah woke with a sense of resolve that steadied her nerves. The cool morning air drifted through the open window as she poured herself a cup of coffee. The conversation with Officer Jared Miller from the night before replayed in her mind. Jared had listened patiently as she explained Margaret's situation. His calm, measured voice had given her a small measure of comfort. "I'll look into it," he had promised. "But Hannah, you need to be prepared. Cases like this, especially involving family, can get complicated." She knew it would not be easy, but Margaret's voice, so fragile yet filled with pain, had strengthened her determination. Later that morning, Hannah drove back to St. Mercy Hospital, her heart pounding slightly as she parked in the familiar lot. She carried a small basket with fresh muffins, unsure if Margaret would be hungry, but wanting to bring something comforting. When she entered Margaret's room, she was greeted by the sight of the older woman sitting up, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Though her face was still pale, her eyes seemed a little brighter. Margaret's face softened when she saw Hannah. "You came back." "Of course," Hannah said, as she placed the basket on the side table. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret gave a small shrug. "Better than I have in a long time." She eyed the basket curiously. "Is that for me?" Hannah smiled. "I thought you might like something homemade." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for a muffin. She took a small bite, her eyes closing as she savored the warm, familiar flavor. "It tastes like home," she murmured. Hannah pulled up a chair. "I talked to someone who can help a detective I know. His name is Jared. He's kind and thorough. I told him about what happened to you." Margaret's hands stilled. She looked down at the blanket, her expression guarded. "What did he say?" "He said it's possible to open a case to hold your son accountable." Hannah leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You do not have to be afraid of Evan anymore." Margaret's shoulders sagged under the weight of the name. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the hum of the machines monitoring her vitals. "I used to be proud of him," Margaret whispered. "He was bright, charming. People loved him. When he was little, he would pick wildflowers for me and leave them on the kitchen table." She paused, her gaze distant. "But when my husband died, something changed. Evan changed." Hannah listened, her heart breaking at the raw vulnerability in Margaret's voice. "He grew resentful," Margaret continued. "He told me that I was a burden, that he couldn't build his life with me holding him back." Her voice faltered, but she pushed forward. "When he asked me to sign over the house, I thought he just wanted to help me handle things. I trusted him." Hannah reached out and gently covered Margaret's hand with her own. "What he did was wrong. None of this was your fault." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I loved him so much. I still do. And that's the hardest part." Hannah nodded, understanding the conflict in Margaret's heart. Love was not something that disappeared, even when it was undeserved. "You can love someone and still hold them accountable," she said softly. Margaret wiped her eyes with the corner of the blanket. "What happens now?" "Jared is going to open an investigation," Hannah explained. "But they'll need your statement, your permission to move forward." Margaret hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. The idea of confronting the truth, the pain seemed almost unbearable. "I will be with you," Hannah assured her. "Every step of the way." Margaret looked into Hannah's steady gaze, seeing not pity, but strength. Slowly she nodded. I will do it. I cannot live in fear anymore." That afternoon, Jared arrived at the hospital, wearing a gray blazer over a simple dress shirt. His friendly but professional demeanor immediately put Margaret at ease. "Mrs. Harper," he greeted her with a respectful nod before turning to Hannah. "Thanks for calling me." Hannah introduced them formally and then stepped aside, giving Margaret space to tell her story. Jared sat patiently, listening as Margaret recounted everything from her husband's passing to the slow unraveling of her relationship with her son. And finally, the day Evan forced her out of her own home. When Margaret finished, Jared's face was grave but compassionate. "I'm so sorry you went through this, Mrs. Harper. No one should be treated that way." Margaret nodded, her eyes damp but steady. "What happens now?" Jared flipped open his notepad. "I'm filing an official report today. With the details you've given me, we can begin gathering evidence, bank records, property transfers, witness statements. This will help build a case." He paused, giving Margaret a reassuring look. "We will make sure you're safe during all of this." Margaret exhaled shakily. "Thank you." Jared stood and extended his hand. "You're incredibly brave for speaking up." Margaret took his hand, her grip firmer than before. "I'm ready to fight for my life back." After Jared left, Margaret looked at Hannah with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "I feel lighter somehow." Hannah smiled. "That is what happens when you take back your power." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm not sure I'll ever understand why Evan did what he did, but at least now I can stop letting it define me." Hannah reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "Margaret, I've been thinking, once you're feeling stronger, would you want to start writing again? You could tell your story in your own words." Margaret's eyes lit up. "I used to keep journals, before everything fell apart." Hannah placed the notebook on the table. "Consider this a new beginning." Margaret picked up the notebook, running her fingers over the cover as if it were something precious. "A new beginning," she repeated softly, a smile breaking across her face. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like her life was her own again, and it was all because someone had seen her when no one else had and cared enough to help her rewrite her story. The days following Margaret's statement felt like a whirlwind. Hannah found herself juggling her daily responsibilities with frequent visits to the hospital and phone calls with Jared. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, wondering if there was an update on Margaret's case. At home, Lily's laughter filled the small apartment as she played with her toys, unaware of the heavy burdens her mother carried. Hannah was grateful for those moments of innocence. They reminded her why it was so important to fight for people like Margaret. One afternoon, Hannah received a call from Jared. She put the call on speaker while folding laundry. "We have started collecting evidence," Jared said. "There are some suspicious transactions on Margaret's accounts that back up her story. But we'll need more statements from anyone who can confirm what happened when Evan took over the house." Hannah paused, holding one of Lily's dresses in her hands. "What if we can find neighbors or old friends who remember what happened?" she asked. "That could help a lot," Jared replied. "The more we can build around Margaret's account, the stronger the case will be." After hanging up, Hannah stood in the middle of the living room, thinking about the next steps. Then, an idea formed in her mind. The following day, after dropping Lily off at preschool, Hannah drove to Rachel Carter's house. Rachel was in her front garden, trimming her rose bushes when she saw Hannah pull up. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and waved. "Well, this is a surprise," Rachel said, smiling as Hannah approached. Hannah returned the smile, though it quickly faded as she explained Margaret's situation. Rachel listened carefully, her face clouding with concern as Hannah recounted everything. "My goodness," Rachel murmured, shaking her head. "That poor woman." She folded her arms thoughtfully. "You know, I think I remember her. I used to see her around town quiet, always tending her garden. And her son? I remember when he came around after her husband passed. There was something off about him. People in the neighborhood noticed the change." Hannah's heart lifted. "Would you be willing to speak to the authorities? It could really help her case." Rachel didn't hesitate. Of course, she deserves justice. Word began to spread around the neighborhood after Rachel's statement. Soon, other neighbors who remembered Margaret and the house she had lost came forward. Carmen Reynolds, who had lived across the street from Margaret's old home, was one of them. "I always thought something wasn't right," Carmen said during her meeting with Jared. "One day she was there, and the next, she was gone. Evan told everyone she moved out to be with relatives, but I never believed it." Jared nodded, taking careful notes. "Did you ever witness any conflicts between Margaret and her son?" Carmen pressed her lips together, recalling the past. "There was one day. I remember seeing her standing on the front porch with tears in her eyes. Evan was shouting at her, waving papers around. I should have asked if she was okay, but I was afraid of getting involved." Jared's expression softened. "What matters is that you're speaking up now." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Margaret's health was steadily improving. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she was walking short distances with the help of a nurse, When Hannah arrived for her usual afternoon visit, Margaret greeted her with a warm, grateful smile. "You won't believe what happened today," Hannah said, as she set down a bag of fresh fruit. "Several people in the neighborhood remember you, and they're willing to help." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "They remember me?" Hannah nodded. "Rachel, Carmen, even the grocer from the old market came forward. They're sharing what they know to support your case." Margaret's hands trembled as she held on to the bed's railing. I thought people had forgotten me, that I was invisible." Hannah's voice was gentle. "You were never invisible, Margaret. You were just pushed into the shadows by someone who didn't deserve your trust." Margaret's eyes glistened as she whispered, "You've given me more than I ever thought possible." Later that evening, Hannah sat in her living room, going over the latest updates Jared had sent her. The investigation was gaining momentum, but there was still a long way to go. She glanced over at Lily, who was coloring a picture of a house surrounded by flowers. "Look, Mommy!" Lily beamed as she held up her drawing. "It's for the lady!" Hannah's heart swelled as she walked over and knelt beside her daughter. "You made this for Margaret?" Lily nodded eagerly. "She needs a new home with flowers." Hannah hugged Lily tightly, tears stinging her eyes. "She'll love it, baby." Lily's small kindness was a reminder of why Hannah was fighting so hard, not just for justice, but to show Margaret that life could still be beautiful, even after so much pain. The next morning, Hannah brought Lily's drawing to Margaret, who was sitting by the window with a blanket draped over her shoulders. "I have something for you," Hannah said with a smile as she handed over the picture. Margaret's eyes softened as she took the drawing. "Is this from Lily?" "Yes," Hannah said. "She wanted you to have a new house full of flowers." Margaret's lips trembled as she traced the colorful lines with her fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Tell her this is the kindest gift I've ever received." "I will," Hannah said softly. Margaret gazed out the window, her eyes filled with quiet hope. "For the first time, I feel like I'm not alone." "You're not," Hannah replied firmly. "We're in this together." Margaret's voice was steady, though her emotions were close to the surface. "I'm ready to rebuild my life, and this time, I won't let anyone take it away." Hannah reached for Margaret's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You're stronger than you know." As the sun rose higher, filling the room with warm light, Margaret held the drawing close to her heart. It was not just a picture, it was a promise of brighter days ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, but Margaret's resolve was stronger than ever. And with the support of Hannah, the neighbors, and everyone who had come forward, she knew she could face whatever came next. The following days brought an unexpected shift in the atmosphere around Willow Street. Neighbors who usually exchanged only brief greetings now gathered to talk about Margaret's story. Some brought food to Hannah's apartment, offering their support in quiet but meaningful ways. Others shared memories of seeing Margaret tending her garden, walking to the market, or sitting on her porch with a warm smile and a wave. Margaret's story had awakened a reminder that behind every house was a life filled with untold stories, and behind every silence was someone who might need help. At the hospital, Margaret had grown stronger each day. The nurses had begun to comment on her resilience, saying they had never seen someone recover so quickly. The warmth from the community and the daily visits from Hannah had given Margaret something she had not felt in a long time: hope. One afternoon, as Hannah arrived with Lily in tow, Margaret's room was filled with soft laughter. Lily skipped ahead, holding another drawing, a picture of Margaret surrounded by flowers and sunshine. "Look, Miss Margaret," Lily exclaimed, climbing up on a chair beside the bed. "This one has even more flowers." Margaret smiled so brightly that it was as though the years of hardship had melted away, if only for a moment. She took the picture from Lily's small hands. "It's beautiful, just like you, sweetheart." Lily beamed and looked up at her mom. Do you think Miss Margaret will come live near us, Mommy? Hannah felt her heart squeeze. She knelt down beside Lily and brushed a strand of hair from her face. We'll see, baby. We're working hard to make sure Margaret has a safe, happy place to call home. Margaret's gaze softened, but Hannah could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that justice might still slip through her fingers. That evening, Hannah received another call from Officer Jared Miller. She set down the dinner plates she was arranging and answered quickly. "Jared," she said, trying to steady her voice, "do we have any news?" Jared exhaled on the other end of the line. "Good news. We've gathered enough evidence to move forward. We've also confirmed that Evan had illegally transferred ownership of Margaret's house. The judge has granted us an emergency hearing to present the case." Hannah's breath caught. "So, what does this mean?" "It means Evan will have to answer for what he did," Jared replied. "There's enough for charges of elder abuse and fraud, but Margaret will need to be there. Her testimony will make all the difference." Hannah felt a mix of relief and nerves. She'll be ready. The next morning, Hannah gently explained everything to Margaret during their visit. Margaret listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When Hannah finished, the older woman's gaze was steady. "I'll speak," Margaret said, her voice resolute. "I've been silent for too long." "You don't have to do this alone," Hannah reassured her. "I'll be there. Jared will be there. And the neighbors. They're rooting for you." Margaret's lips trembled, but she smiled through the emotions. "I never thought I'd have so many people standing with me." The day of the hearing came quickly. The courthouse was small and simple, with sunlight streaming in through high windows. Margaret was seated at the front with Hannah by her side, offering silent encouragement with a squeeze of her hand. Jared stood confidently, organizing the files that outlined every piece of evidence they had gathered. Margaret was dressed in a simple but elegant blouse and slacks that Rachel had given her a reminder that she still had dignity, despite what she had endured. The courtroom murmured softly as Evan entered, his polished suit a stark contrast to the tension in his face. He barely glanced at his mother as he took his seat. Margaret's heart twisted. He was still her son, but she knew now that love did not mean accepting cruelty. The judge, an older woman with a calm but firm demeanor, began the session. Jared presented the evidence clearly: bank transfers, witness testimonies, and documents showing how Evan had manipulated his mother into signing over the house. Finally, it was Margaret's turn to speak. She stood slowly, leaning on a cane the nurse had given her. Hannah watched her closely, ready to offer support if she needed it. But Margaret stood tall, despite her frailty. She took a deep breath and faced the courtroom. "My name is Margaret Harper," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I've lived through many things in my life. I've known love and loss, joy and heartbreak. But nothing prepared me for the pain of being betrayed by my own son." A hushed silence fell over the room. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "I trusted Evan because he was my family. I believed him when he said he wanted to help me. But instead, he took everything I had and left me with nothing, not even a place to call home." She paused, meeting her son's gaze for the first time in years. "I loved you, Evan. I still do. But love cannot excuse what you've done. You left me to suffer alone, and I will not let that story be the end of my life." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she lifted her chin. "I deserve justice, and I deserve to live in peace." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Hannah felt her own eyes fill with tears, awed by Margaret's quiet courage. The judge's expression softened as she addressed Margaret. "Thank you for your testimony, Mrs. Harper. Your strength is remarkable." Jared stood and made his closing statement, weaving together the evidence with Margaret's words in a way that left no room for doubt. When the judge finally issued her ruling, Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "The court finds that Evan Harper's actions constitute fraud and elder abuse," the judge declared. "He will be held accountable for his actions. Additionally, Mrs. Harper's home will be returned to her, along with appropriate restitution for her suffering." Margaret gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand as relief flooded her. Hannah wrapped her arms around Margaret, holding her tightly as tears of joy streamed down both their faces. "You did it," Hannah whispered. "You took back your life." Margaret nodded, overwhelmed but grateful. "We did it," she corrected, squeezing Hannah's hand. "I never could have done this without you." Hannah smiled. "You're not alone anymore." For the first time in years, Margaret felt free from fear, free from the shadows of the past. The long road of pain and betrayal had led her to this moment of triumph, surrounded by unexpected kindness and unwavering support. As they left the courthouse, Margaret stepped into the sunlight with her head held high. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she was certain of one thing: her life was her own again. And with people like Hannah by her side, it would be filled with hope, resilience, and the promise of brighter days. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass as Hannah and Margaret walked down the courthouse steps together. Margaret paused for a moment, closing her eyes as the sunlight brushed her face. "I forgot how good it feels to stand in the sun without fear," Margaret murmured, her voice soft but steady. Hannah smiled as she stood beside her. "You've earned this, Margaret. Every bit of it." The small group of neighbors who had come to show their support gathered nearby, clapping and cheering quietly. Rachel Carter was there, along with Carmen Reynolds and a few others who had spoken up during the case. They waved as Margaret passed, their smiles full of pride. Margaret's eyes shimmered as she lifted her hand in a grateful wave. "I never thought I'd have people cheering for me." "You deserve it," Hannah said. "You fought for yourself, and you won." Later that day, back at the hospital, Margaret sat by the window, gazing out at the city below. The weight of the past had been heavy for so long that it felt strange to breathe without it pressing down on her. Jared stopped by to check in, still in his blazer from the courtroom. "How are you holding up?" he asked as he entered. Margaret gave him a small smile. "Lighter, tired but lighter." Jared nodded and sat across from her. "You were incredible today. The judge saw your strength, and so did everyone else in that room." Margaret's smile grew, though her eyes were distant for a moment. "There's still a part of me that can't believe it's over, that I have my home back." "You do," Jared reassured her. "The paperwork is being processed. Soon enough, you'll have the keys in your hand again." Margaret exhaled slowly, letting the truth of those words settle in. "And Evan?" she asked quietly. Jared's face grew somber. "He'll face the consequences for what he did. He won't be able to hurt you or anyone else again." Margaret nodded. There was no joy in knowing her son would face punishment, only a sense of closure. She had loved him, and she always would, but she could no longer carry the burden of his betrayal. A week later, Margaret was discharged from the hospital. Hannah insisted on driving her home and greeted her with a small welcome-back gift, another bouquet of daisies and a new notebook, just like the one she had given Margaret when their journey began. Lily ran to Margaret as she entered the apartment. "Miss Margaret, I made you more pictures." Margaret chuckled and hugged Lily tightly. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll hang them up in my new room." The day was filled with warmth and laughter as Margaret settled into Hannah's home, while arrangements were made to restore her house. They had decided she would stay with Hannah for a while, at least until she felt ready to return to the place that had once been hers. A few days later, Hannah and Margaret visited Margaret's house for the first time since the case was closed. The drive there was quiet, each of them wrapped in their own thoughts. When they pulled into the driveway, Margaret's breath caught. The house had been cleaned and repaired, fresh paint on the shutters, the overgrown bushes trimmed back into shape. "It looks almost the same," Margaret whispered as she stepped out of the car, her hand resting on the doorframe. Hannah stood beside her, gently placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "It's your home again." Margaret walked slowly toward the front door, her steps hesitant but steady. She reached for the handle, and for a moment her hand hovered as old memories resurfaced, the good and the painful. Then, with a deep breath, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The living room was filled with soft sunlight streaming in through the windows. The familiar scent of cedarwood lingered faintly, and Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "It feels like stepping into a memory. It's your present now," Hannah said gently. Margaret wandered from room to room, her fingertips brushing along the furniture as if to confirm it was all real. She paused by the window, where her favorite plants had once grown, and imagined the blooms that would fill the space again. In the weeks that followed, the community continued to rally around Margaret. Neighbors stopped by to help her unpack boxes, clean the windows, and even bring small gifts: hand-sewn curtains, pots of flowers for her new garden, and home-baked pies. One afternoon, Rachel and Carmen arrived with shovels and seedlings. "It's time to bring the garden back to life," Rachel announced with a grin. Margaret's heart swelled as they worked side by side, planting daisies, lavender, and wildflowers in the fresh soil. By the time they were done, the yard was filled with bursts of color and the gentle hum of bees. Margaret sat on her old porch swing, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. The ache in her heart had not disappeared completely, but it no longer defined her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hannah, David, and Lily came over for dinner. The table was set with candles, and the smell of roasted vegetables filled the air. Lily ran ahead and climbed onto Margaret's lap, giggling as Margaret hugged her. "Do you like living in your house again, Miss Margaret?" Lily asked, resting her head on Margaret's shoulder. Margaret smiled and nodded. "I love it, sweetheart. But do you know what I love even more?" "What?" "The people who made me believe in life again." Lily grinned. "That's us." Hannah and David laughed as they joined them on the porch. "You're part of our family now, Margaret," Hannah said, taking a seat beside her. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "I never thought I'd feel this again, like I belong somewhere." David nodded. "That's what family does. We lift each other up." They sat together, sharing stories and memories as the sky turned deep blue and the stars began to twinkle above. Margaret had reclaimed not just her house, but her life. And while the scars of her past would always be there, they no longer defined her. The kindness of others had given her a new beginning, a life built not on loss, but on resilience and love. She looked around at the people gathered on her porch, laughter filling the air, and felt something settle in her heart. She was no longer alone. She was home. The early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Margaret's home, casting soft golden patterns across the hardwood floors. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Margaret stood in her kitchen, humming softly. Her hands moved with quiet confidence as she stirred sugar into her cup. The warmth of the house wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, one she had not felt in years. Outside, the garden was alive with color. Rows of daisies swayed gently in the breeze, their cheerful yellow and white blossoms catching the sunlight. The sight made Margaret's heart swell. It was more than a garden. It was a symbol of everything she had reclaimed. There was a knock at the door, and Margaret wiped her hands on a towel before answering it. Hannah stood on the porch with Lily, holding a box of pastries from their favorite cafe. "Good morning," Hannah greeted with a bright smile. "We thought we'd bring breakfast." Lily ran forward, hugging Margaret's legs. "I missed you." Margaret laughed and bent down to scoop Lily into her arms. "I missed you too, sweetheart." Hannah stepped inside, setting the box of pastries on the kitchen table. "How does it feel, waking up in your own home again?" Margaret set Lily down and poured Hannah a cup of coffee. "Like I've finally woken up from a bad dream." She paused, glancing around the cozy space. "There are moments I still can't believe it's real." Hannah took a sip of her coffee, her gaze warm. It's real, Margaret, and it's only the beginning. Margaret nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I've been thinking a lot about what I want this new chapter of my life to look like. She gestured toward the notebook Hannah had given her weeks ago, now filled with pages of neat handwriting. I've started writing things down, memories, plans, ideas for the future. Hannah's eyes lit up. That's wonderful. What kind of plans? Margaret chuckled softly. Well, for one, I want to host a dinner for everyone who helped me, Rachel, Carmen, the neighbors, and you, of course. I want to thank all of you properly. Hannah reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. We'd love that. But Margaret, you've already given us so much. Your strength has been an inspiration. Margaret's eyes softened as she looked at Hannah. I never thought I'd have a family again, but somehow you made that possible. The following weekend, Margaret's house buzzed with life as neighbors gathered for the dinner she had planned. The dining table was set with fresh flowers and homemade dishes, each one made with care. The smell of roasted chicken and baked bread filled the air. Laughter echoed through the rooms as everyone mingled. Rachel Carter and Carmen Reynolds sat by the window, sipping iced tea and sharing stories. David, Hannah's husband, was helping carry plates from the kitchen, while Lily ran from room to room, giggling as she played hide-and-seek with the other children who had come. Margaret stood back for a moment, watching the scene unfold with quiet wonder. Her home, once empty and filled with painful memories, was now warm and full of life. Hannah appeared beside her, a glass of lemonade in hand. It's a beautiful night, isn't it? Margaret nodded, her heart full. I didn't think I'd ever have something like this again. You made it happen, Hannah said. This is your home, your life, and you brought all of us together. Margaret's gaze drifted to the garden outside, where the flowers she had planted with Rachel and Carmen were blooming under the soft glow of the string lights hung across the porch. I think this is what I've been searching for all along, Margaret murmured. Not just a house, but a home filled with people who care. As the night grew late, the guests began to trickle out, offering hugs and words of encouragement as they left. Rachel was the last to leave, lingering at the door. You've come a long way, Margaret, Rachel said, her eyes shining with pride. I'm so glad I got to witness it. Margaret hugged her tightly. Thank you for being there for me, Rachel. I'll never forget it. When the house was finally quiet again, Margaret returned to the kitchen, where Hannah was gathering the last of the dishes. You didn't have to stay to clean up, Margaret said with a smile. Hannah waved a hand dismissively. I wouldn't dream of leaving you with all of this. They worked together in companionable silence, stacking plates and wiping down the counters. After the last dish was put away, they stepped outside to the porch, where the night air was cool and refreshing. Margaret sank into her porch swing, sighing contentedly as she swayed gently back and forth. Hannah took a seat beside her. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Margaret began, about this being a new beginning. I want to make sure I use it wisely. Hannah tilted her head. What do you mean? Margaret's gaze was steady as she spoke. I want to help others the way you helped me. There are so many people out there who feel forgotten, like I did. If I can give even one person hope, it'll be worth it. Hannah's smile widened. I think that's an incredible idea. Margaret took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. It feels like my life has meaning again, not just because of what I've been through, but because of what I can do moving forward. Hannah reached over and took Margaret's hand. You're going to make a difference. I know it. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars flicker overhead. In that quiet moment, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Her journey had been long and filled with pain, but it had also brought her to a place of healing and purpose. She had found her way home, not just to a house, but to the people who had shown her that she mattered. Margaret closed her eyes and let the sounds of the night wash over her, the rustle of the leaves, the hum of crickets, and the soft laughter of a child drifting from the window. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The days after the dinner passed in a peaceful rhythm. Margaret had settled into her new life with quiet joy, tending her garden in the mornings, and filling her afternoons with reading, writing in her notebook, and walking the neighborhood. Wherever she went, neighbors waved and stopped to chat. Margaret had become a familiar and welcome presence, no longer a forgotten face, but a woman whose resilience had inspired everyone who knew her. One morning, as Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Hannah arrived with Lily, bouncing happily at her side. "Miss Margaret, guess what?" Lily called as she ran up the steps. Margaret laughed and set her tea down. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily held up a flyer she had colored with bright crayons. "We're having a garden party at the park. Mommy said you should come and show everyone your flowers." Margaret's eyes twinkled as she accepted the flyer. The edges were smudged with crayon, and Lily had drawn a picture of daisies in the corner. "I would love that." Hannah smiled as she sat beside Margaret. "I thought it might be a good way for you to meet even more people and maybe share your story if you're ready." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I think I am." She paused, glancing at Hannah with a warm smile. "You know, when I first met you, I didn't think I'd ever want to speak about what happened. But now, I understand that telling my story can help someone else." The day of the garden party arrived with clear skies and a soft breeze. The park was filled with colorful tents and tables covered in flowers and handmade decorations. Margaret's table was set up near the path, decorated with pots of fresh daisies and lavender she had grown herself. Neighbors stopped by to admire the flowers, and children ran through the grass, laughing as they played. Margaret stood tall, greeting people with a smile and answering their questions about the flowers she loved so much. "These are beautiful," a young woman said, as she leaned in to smell a sprig of lavender. "Did you grow all of these yourself?" Margaret nodded. "I did. Gardening has always been a way for me to find peace." The woman smiled softly. "I lost my mother last year. She used to love lavender. I've been looking for ways to feel closer to her. Maybe gardening is something I can try." Margaret's heart swelled with compassion. She reached for a small pot of lavender and handed it to the woman. "Take this," she said gently. "Let it remind you that she's still with you." Tears glistened in the woman's eyes as she accepted the pot. "Thank you. I will." Hannah watched the exchange from across the lawn, her heart brimming with pride. Margaret wasn't just sharing her flowers, she was sharing the strength and kindness that had carried her through the hardest days of her life. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Rachel Carter waved as she approached, carrying a plate of cookies wrapped in a checkered napkin. "Margaret," Rachel greeted with a wide smile. "Your garden table is the talk of the party." Margaret chuckled and gestured to the flowers. "It feels good to share something beautiful." Rachel handed her the plate of cookies. "These are for you. You've given this neighborhood so much more than flowers." Margaret accepted the cookies, her eyes misting. "You were one of the first people to see me, when I thought no one ever would again. I'll never forget that." Rachel reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand. "We see you now, Margaret, and we always will." As the party wound down, the crowd began to thin. Hannah, David, and Lily helped Margaret pack up her flowers and carry the pots back to the car. The sunset painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, and the air was filled with the hum of crickets. When they arrived back at Margaret's house, Hannah paused on the porch. "Today was incredible," she said. "You brought so much joy to people today, Margaret." Margaret looked out over her garden, where the daisies swayed gently in the fading light. "It wasn't just about the flowers," she said softly. "It was about showing people that life can bloom again, even after everything feels lost." Hannah smiled as she reached for Margaret's hand. "You've taught all of us that." That night, after everyone had gone home, Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, the stars twinkling above the quiet street. The house was silent, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that comes when everything feels as it should be. She opened her notebook and began to write. I once believed that my life had ended the day I lost my home and my family. But I've learned that home isn't just a place. It's the people who remind you that you're not alone. It's the kindness of strangers who become friends, and the small moments that remind you how strong you really are. Margaret paused, watching the breeze ruffle the leaves outside. For anyone who feels invisible, unheard, or forgotten, know this. Your story isn't over. There are people out there who care, who will see you, and who will help you stand again. I am living proof that even in the darkest times, kindness can light the way home. Margaret closed the notebook and placed it on the table. She wrapped herself in her soft, woven blanket and let herself rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new beginnings and new memories to cherish. Her journey had taught her that life could be unpredictable and filled with pain, but it could also be beautiful, kind, and hopeful. And she was determined to live every moment of it with gratitude. The next morning, the sun rose over Willow Street, painting the world in gold. In the quiet of her garden, the daisies stood tall, blooming brightly under the new day's light. Margaret stepped outside, feeling the soft earth beneath her feet and the warmth of the sun on her face. She had come so far back from the shadows, surrounded now by love, hope, and a family that had grown from kindness. She smiled as she whispered to herself, "I'm home." Margaret's story reminds us all that even in our darkest moments, kindness, resilience, and hope can lead us to brighter days. Her journey is a testament to the power of community, the strength to rise above hardship, and the importance of never giving up on ourselves or each other. If you enjoyed this story and found it inspiring, please give it a like and share it with someone who may need a reminder that they are not alone. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of courage, kindness, and hope. Your support encourages us to continue bringing you meaningful stories every week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.